Carol is the author of White Rage that won the National Book Circle Critic Award. And Greg is the co-founder of the Coalition for Immokalee Worker, last year's MacArthur Genius Award winner. He hates when I say that. And I know, I'm going to ruin it for you, Greg. And the strategist behind the Campaign for Fair Food and the architect of the Fair Food Program. So I'm going to open it up with a question and then just step back and let you two speak to each other. Carol, your book, White Rage, has gotten a lot of attention lately. And my question to open this up is, how do human rights values and human rights vision respond to what you coined White Rage?
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you all for being here. What I want to first lay out is how I defined white rage, because too often we think of rage and white as being like the Ku Klux Klan, or like the folks marching in Charlottesville with the tiki torches, saying, "You will not replace us," or however that went, right? But that's not what I mean by white rage. White rage are those policies that systematically, smoothly, methodically undercut human rights. They undercut black advancement. We see that trigger when African Americans gain some semblance of their rights, that a wave of policies emanating out of Congress, out of the Supreme Court, out of the White House, out of school boards, out of zoning commissions, systematically go through and begin to figure out, how do we whittle this thing away while looking like we're still on this side of the rights argument? How do we whittle away voting rights while looking like we're still on this side of the 15th Amendment? How do we whittle away your right to quality education while looking like we still believe in Brown? How do we whittle away your right to housing while looking like we're still on this side of Shelley v. Kramer? You know, how do we do this? And white rage figures it out. And the debris that it leaves in its place, where it leaves broken children, it leaves broken communities, it leaves decaying housing, where we're asking people to actually live in places that are absolutely uninhabitable, where we've got lead coursing through the water. That's how white rage works. And so first, to understand that it's those policies, that the violence that we often think of is simply a mere symptom of it, but it's the way that the respectable folk allow that violence to happen and then implement those policies. And so where white rage then comes in, where the counter to that has been those communities fighting for their dignity, fighting for their humanity, fighting strategically and smartly. I mean, this is what we saw coming out of the Civil War. It's what we saw with the Great Migration. It's what we saw with Brown. It's what we saw with the Civil Rights Movement. And it's what we saw with the organizing that put Barack Obama in the White House. Those measures, that kind of work, that kind of community-based work is in fact the massive trigger for white rage. But one of the things that becomes very clear is that the community never said, "Dang, that's it, man, can't do nothing." But said, "No, son, not today, Satan, step back." Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I've lived and worked in Florida for the past 27 years of my life on this earth. And Florida is a state that is not unaccustomed to white rage. And I work in a community that is a farm worker community, a community made up mainly of people who pick fruits and vegetables for a living. Quick question, does anybody here pick fruits or vegetables for a living? Okay. That's an important question and an important fact, just to kind of keep in the back of your mind for a little bit. And that industry that we work in and that we're organizing in, that we're fighting to change, as you said, has been defined from day one, when you think about the history of U.S. agriculture, by that sort of philosophy, by white supremacy, by the lie of white supremacy that says some people can own other people to do work for free, and if they don't do it, we can kill them, because they're not really people. That gave us U.S. agriculture. There's been an arc since, but that arc has not bent toward justice that far quite yet. You know, the New Deal, which is one of the more important bendings of the arc in our country for a lot of different populations, excluded farm workers, precisely to get the votes of Southern Democrats and domestic workers for reasons of race. So all that has continued, and to this day, you know, and just to give you a little anecdote of how it continues, even in the program that we have created, which has really changed people's lives immeasurably. In the early days of the program, there was an organic grower in Florida who was well known for being, you know, sort of the prototypical progressive organic grower. And we were talking about the shade provision, the provision that required shade in the fields, right? Now, if anybody's ever been in the South in the summertime in 100+ degrees and working for hour after hour, you know that shade is something you'd like to be able to take advantage of every now and then, right? But his position was, that's ridiculous. Why should we have to provide shade? These people love the sun. That's a quote, not one told to me, one said to me, right? These people love the sun and they don't need that whatsoever. Well, he needed, in the end, he had to put in shade. But much to his chagrin. But that is the kind of system that we have found and that we have been working since the early 90s to change. And we've used the human rights framework to do so.
And one of the things that I love about the human rights framework, I started my work, actually, let me talk about the first book, Eyes Off the Prize. The United Nations and the African American Struggle for Human Rights, 1944 to 1955. And it began because I was trying to figure out how my neighborhood became the hood. I was trying to figure out how in my neighborhood, with all of those God-fearing folk who got up and went to work every day, who loved their children something fierce, you know, all checking all of those boxes about, you know, if only you would, if only you would, if only you would, and they are doing, and to systematically watch that neighborhood collapse right in front of me. And I'm thinking about, these are the folks that when you walked into their home, they would have the Trinity on their mantle. You know, that's not Jesus, God, and the Holy Ghost. That's Martin Luther King, right? Jack Kennedy, right? And Abraham Lincoln. You know, they had the Trinity there. They believed. And so how did something as powerful as the civil rights movement leave us with all of these communities that are absolutely decimated? And that's what began the hunt for the quest for human rights in the United States in my work. And the power of that is that I saw in the mid-40s, coming during the Second World War, how African Americans were conceptualizing their struggle not as a civil rights struggle, but as a human rights struggle. They were saying that the vote is powerful, and we're going to fight for the vote. But we need quality education. No, we have a right to quality education. We have a right to quality health care. We have a right to quality employment, jobs with a living wage. I mean, as they're going down that list, and they are fighting like crazy for it. And then the second Red Scare, all of the communist witch hunts, the aligning of this frame with communism, and watching their allies and their organizations put under such stress. But what I saw in that moment, though, was that they understood that this wasn't just about black folks' rights. This was about people's rights. This was about, if we can change this system to honor the humanity of people, then we're going to have a truly just system. And that hell of a war that we just came through, where you've got like 60 million dead, that it will not have been in vain, because we are going to have a society that values human beings. And I saw black organizations working with a range of other peoples in this coalition to in fact create this just world. That was the power of the human rights frame for me, that it began to whittle away at one of the things that white rage work is so good at: divide and conquer, and the zero-sum game, that the only way that you can get will be at my expense. Human rights just blew that thing wide open, because it was like, you know, there's enough here for everybody. The problem is that it has been distributed so horrifically wrong that you've got folks who are doing everything they're supposed to do and can't breathe. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on it, that the community itself feels the power of human rights, and that was certainly the case in our case, right? You know, the community that makes up Immokalee is, you know, equal parts Guatemalan, Haitian, Mexican, indigenous from Guatemala and Mexico, all places where they have been leading struggles for years with incredible strategies and techniques for organizing and for fighting far harder opponents, far more vicious opponents than we often do here. And so they have always seen their fights in terms of human rights, in terms of fundamental human right to live, you know. And so when we started organizing, that was what came out of the community. But then the interesting thing is that we had to find a way to translate that to the rest of the world, because we knew that as farm workers, we could organize all day long, and our power was limited. There was not, when you are as poor as farm workers are, you can't do what workers generally do or used to do to have power at the workplaces, withhold your labor. When you are so poor that you withhold your labor and you have to go back to work within 4 or 5 days, you find out that leash is not long enough for you to be able to bite the person you're trying to bite. You get yanked back, and you go back to work, and the whole thing loses force. We did that several times ourselves down there. So we realized that there was another path we had to find. We found we had to build power. We analyzed and we saw the different sources of power that were making farm workers poor, right? And we can get into that maybe in a little bit, but the main issue at this point is that we needed to build power that the community itself didn't have. So we had to communicate this situation with others. We had to find who had the power that we could harness in order to make the change we wanted to make. And that's what's beautiful about the human rights framework too, which is that it doesn't really it's not aimed at the head. It's not aimed at conscious sort of intellectualism. It's aimed at the gut when you think about human rights. You mentioned it, the war, the decade of the 40s was the most violent, most evil decade in modern history. I mean, just pure, unadulterated evil. And it was like an orgy of just death. And it sounds kind of weird to put it in those terms, but that's what it was. People, whether it was Hiroshima or the Holocaust or just people fighting, people died by the millions. And so that woke us up as a people, and when that nightmare ended, out of it came the UN Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which was essentially a catalog of all the evil stuff people do. I didn't say the word I was going to say, evil stuff people do to others, and flipped it on its head and said, this is what you shall not do in the future, ever again, right? And so that, it's all based on this visceral reaction we have when we see these things happen. And so we were able to actually tap into that, and what we do Let me just, if I got a second. Yeah. So a lot of times when I'm talking to a new audience, an audience that's new to the question of farm labor, or to the countryside for that matter, which is kind of why I asked how many people work in the fields. I asked them to do a thought experiment with me, just a couple minutes, right? So put yourselves in your minds on a country road with farms on either side, right? And you're driving, and everybody's been at some point out there. I know this is New York City, but I know everybody's been on a country road at some point in their lives. And there's farms on both sides, and then you roll up and there's a farm stand with all this beautiful fruit and vegetables picked straight from the field, right? And you like to eat that sort of stuff, so you roll in, you park, and you get out, and you can't believe what you're seeing. It smells beautiful, it's colorful, you know, most perfect watermelon, peaches you just want to eat before you pay for them. And so you fill your bags, and you go to the cash register, and the person there is very nice, and they're ringing you up. And as it's going on, you're thinking about how much longer you got before you got to eat that food. And just as they're about to finish ringing you up, a horrible scream comes from just behind the cash register in the field where the stuff came from. And you look up over the cashier's shoulder, and you see a woman being sexually assaulted by her boss in the back of a truck in the field where your food that you're about to buy comes from. And then as you're looking at the field, you realize there's another guy on the other corner who's being beaten. He's trying to shield himself. He's being beaten and kicked by his boss because he stopped to drink water at work instead of working. And at that point, the cashier turns to you and says, "That'll be $21.75. Big smile. What would you do? Would anybody finish that purchase? Would everybody take their money out of their pocket and finish that purchase? No, right? That's the power of human rights. You can strip everything else away, strip the distance between people and where food comes from, strip all the thing about what kind of person is it that's getting sexually assaulted in the truck. Take that out of the equation, right? Take all those things away and just strip it down to that violence, to that essence of violence. It's something that we all, through empathy, can't accept. And there you touch people in the gut. And when you do that, then you have access to their minds. And then you can bring analysis and everything else in and help figure out how they can lend you their power, and we can work together to fight power with power and change the conditions that come out of all that.
As you know, Greg, I went on a couple of the protest marches down in Florida with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. And wow, and to be there in that moment. So we're marching, and we're marching against a grocery store that didn't care that, you know, when the atrocities that are happening in the field were brought to them, they were like, what do we care if there are atrocities? It's not our business. And we're like, no, son, not today. Not today. And in that group marching, and I was marching alongside Kathy, I'm looking up, and for me, it looks like humanity. I'm seeing black folk and brown folk and white folk and Asian folk. I'm seeing folk. And we are marching. And we understand why we are marching. We are marching for dignity. We are marching so that the abuses that are happening in the field don't happen. We are marching so that people can be paid a living wage, so that they can actually live. I mean, it sounds like, but in the fields, folks are working so hard, and they have nothing to show for that work. And we're like, no. And as we're marching, there was this moment where this pickup truck rolls by. Yeah, you know the kind.
Central Florida now.
And starts yelling that we need to go back where we came from, and they want their country and what the heck doggone ever. And here again was the power of human rights. Two things emerged from that just I went, wow. One is I saw a resilience in that group, because as they were yelling, go back to where you came from, everybody there. There was none of that kind of division about who was an immigrant or who was an American or any of that. We were one because that dignity that was being violated was violating all of us. The second piece is that the resolve to go, no, son, not today, but it was done with a kind of lack of toxicity, right? So to be able to be resilient, to fight for your dignity, and to do so while also maintaining your humanity, wow, that was some serious power there. And that's what I see in this struggle, using human rights as the frame.
I knew this was going to be the hardest part, ending each of these. Yes, I know, right? That's, next time we'll do an hour each, see if people can do a marathon. But, you know, one thing that you can see in the report or on the CIW website or on the Worker-Driven Social Responsibility website is what emerged out of that struggle. The most extraordinary solution that has transformed farm work. So I really encourage you to read about it, to look it up, but let's just say that if you read the end of the story, it's got a great ending. Thank you.